So today I'm just going to give a brief talk about MND research, how you can get involved in MND research, and touch on some of the clinical trials that are currently going on in Australia. So I'm from the University of Queensland, and I also do research across two of the major hospitals in Brisbane. So the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital, which is a public hospital, and Wesley Medical Research, which is a private hospital. So getting involved in MND research, there are a lot of pros and cons of being involved in research, and if you are looking at becoming involved, I think it's important to be able to sit down and think through the pros and cons and whether it works for you. What's important to know is that research is completely voluntary. You can go to a research clinic, get told about all of the research that's going on, and at that point you can either decide to consent to be involved, you can go away and think about it and provide consent at a later date, or you can just decide that it's not for you because there are other things you would like to do with your life. Now, the reason why we do clinical research, and I'm quite involved in some of the research that's going on in Brisbane, is really to try and advance treatments for MND. We want to look at research because we want to understand more about the disease. We can only treat the disease if we can understand what is actually happening between different people. Rather than coming in with this blind approach and going, we're just going to try this, we should be looking at specific things that are happening in disease and trying to target that for the specific individual. So as part of the research, we're trying to understand more about the disease that is going to let us improve survival, but also slow progression, improve quality of life for people living with the disease, and of course finding that cure that everyone so desperately needs. And what's important is that clinical research is high quality and comprehensive. It needs to address a lot of aspects about MND because, as you would have heard already today, it's a very complex disease, and it's not just the one thing that triggers the onset of MND between one individual to the next. And what's important about clinical research is that it adds knowledge to what we already know about MND so that we can ask more questions. Getting involved in MND research, I've had a lot of patients tell us that they love being involved in the research because they inadvertently get more attention. So they're not just seeing the neurologist every 3 months, they're also coming to see the research scientists, and the research scientists tend to work very closely with the clinical nurses. And so when you're coming in for a research visit, you might flag something to the research scientist that you can't wait to see the neurologist for. And then in general, we would get in touch with the clinical nurse and they would come over and help you deal with those issues at that point in time. And so you have more attention and oversight of care. One thing about clinical research is that you're also being proactive and, in a sense, contributing to the greater good. And I think a lot of people understand that when they're involved in research, it may not necessarily help them now, but they're contributing to something bigger. And it adds to your knowledge. So at the end of our research visits, we always sit down and have coffee and cake with our patients. And we always ask them, is there anything else that they would like to ask us? Not just about the research that was done on the day, but about anything that's going on in the world. And we can look up any publications on the scientific research that's going on in the world and relate that back to the patient. So in Brisbane, we do a lot of research. It starts off at the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital, as well as the Wesley Hospital. Patients are recruited into research primarily at the Royal Brisbane Hospital, which is a public hospital. We had a lot of interest in people getting involved, and so in Brisbane we have specifically set up a research clinic every Thursday afternoon where people who are interested can come and see us, and we can talk to them for about an hour or 2 hours about all of the research that's going on in Brisbane and what they want to be involved in. Of course, the Royal Brisbane is also the Brisbane site for the clinical trials that are going on in Australia. So rather than just the hospitals, a lot of the research that people participate in, they donate samples, whether that's blood or whether that's a skin or muscle biopsy. And these samples actually get shared across a lot of the research institutes in Brisbane. And we have multiple researchers across many research institutes, across multiple sites that are actually all involved in looking at very different aspects of the disease. So what research we're interested in, particularly my group, is this concept that your body mass index is correlated with greater risk of disease, faster progression and shorter survival. So Rebecca Ahmed would have touched on one side of the coin this morning about high cholesterol being protective. Well, we do know that if you have a lower BMI, before you even experience any onset of disease symptoms, that you will get, some people experience significant weight loss actually before they develop symptoms of MND. If your BMI is lower before you develop these symptoms, you tend to be at greater risk of developing these symptoms. And weight loss prior to your diagnosis is one of these indicators of a greater risk for shorter survival. But one thing that's really interesting is that it's not as simple as high or low BMI, and it's potentially you get a lot of advice to say maintain your weight, or please don't lose weight, or try to put on weight. It's not a very easy relationship, because what we know what happens in MND is that if you've got very low BMI, so if you're very underweight, or you've got very high BMI, which means you're in the extremely obese range, your survival is actually shorter. So there seems to be this sweet spot in body mass index or weight that seems to be better for survival in motor neuron disease. And one thing that's been shown time and time again is that if you have weight loss throughout disease progression, you are more likely to have shorter survival. And there are a lot of things that could contribute to weight loss. People are losing muscle mass, people might not be eating as much as what they used to be, and so they're naturally going to be losing weight. But this is a research question that we're very interested in, because weight seems to be something that could be easily maintained in a population of people. So in 2015, my husband and I, who do a lot of research together, so we spend 24/7 together, we talk about research all the time, we wanted to run a study to see what was actually contributing to weight loss in motor neuron disease. What we know about weight in people is that energy in equals energy out plus growth. And so the idea is we wanted to look at this energy balance. Was it that people were using more energy than what was expected, and that they were eating less, so they were losing weight more rapidly than anyone else? But in order to do this, we needed to develop a means to be able to measure energy expenditure or energy use in people with MND. We'd gone through the literature 20 years prior to us, and there have been many methods for measuring energy use, but they've all been very inconsistent. So we're not actually sure what the data means. And Derek and I have come from a basic science background. We did a lot of research in mice, and everything in mice is very, very controlled. Everything's done at the same time of the day. The mice are on the same genetic background. We only use males because female mice have different hormones, and we thought maybe we need to bring in some sort of these tight, stringent controls for the research with people. So we wanted to develop a platform to be able to measure energy use in people with MND. And it took us a few months to do it, and we put ourselves through the experiments to make sure that people would be able to get involved without, I guess, going through too much, and that it wouldn't be too stressful for the patients. And we wanted to develop something that had a very strong core that we could then build modules on top of to ask additional research questions. It needed to be clinic and patient friendly, but it also needed to be robust at the same time. And the idea is that if we could meet these three criteria, we could actually scale up our experiments and actually spread them across to other research clinics across the world and start looking at energy use in patients all around the world. So we were able to do this. We wrote a lot of applications to get specialized equipment to be able to measure people's body composition, so how much fat and muscle was on someone's body. And we got this machine for measuring how someone breathes. So your body is very much like a fire. The more oxygen you consume, the hotter you're burning. So this machine actually measures how much oxygen you're consuming and how much carbon dioxide you're producing. And from that, we can figure out your body's energy use. And we've been able to add all of these cores to our method, where we can look at fasting blood glucose, how your blood sugar might be impacted in disease. We take blood samples from our patients. Ian did touch on that the blood samples get used for screening genetics. And the blood samples that we take get sent to big groups in Brisbane and also to Ian for screening genetics. And we look at how the body's way of using energy might be linked to typical things that people measure in the clinic when it comes to your disease progression. Your function, as in your physical function, the ALS-FRS scale that the clinical nurses always tend to ask. Disease duration, when you started developing symptoms, when you were diagnosed, and of course, your breathing function. And we repeat these experiments in our patients every 3 months. We also recruit controls into these studies. In fact, as of last week, we've had 98 people without MND involved in this study, and we've had 90 people with MND involved in this study. And we started this in April 2015. So after a few years, we actually published the first results from this study in April of 2018. And so using this method to measure energy use and sort of looking at the relationships between energy use and the clinical scores, disease progression and respiration, what we found was that a lot of people with MND have hypermetabolism, and that this is linked to how they actually progress throughout the disease. So this is the research paper that was published, and we showed that people with MND have increased energy use at rest. People tend to call this hypermetabolism in the field, which means you're just burning hotter than what is expected for someone who's your age, gender, height, and weight. And so, in fact, MND patients in our study were 5 times more likely to have this increase in energy use. And you might think, okay, well, why is that important? Why would burning hotter be important when it comes to the context of disease? Well, what we did was we looked at this hypermetabolism and we compared it to all those parameters. And the one thing we found was that hypermetabolic patients, or patients who had this increase in energy use, and that's represented by this red line here, they're twice as more likely to pass away within the first 12 months of seeing us and undergoing this assessment. So it seems that the way that your body responds to MND from an energy use perspective might actually impact how quickly you're progressing through disease. So now that we found this, we wanted to know whether this would impact weight loss, because we figured if you're burning hotter, then you're going to be using more energy, you're going to be burning through your fat, burning through your muscle, and you're going to lose weight. And in actual fact, that was not the case. So the hypermetabolic patients are again in the pink red line here. I don't know if you can see that very well. And the people with MND who have normal metabolism, so they don't have this change in energy use, they're the blue line. And you can see that the weight loss is almost stacked on top of each other. So the two groups of patients are actually losing weight equally as quickly as each other. So a lot of the future research that we're doing is trying to figure out what contributes to this weight loss in MND. Because if we know what's happening, we can actually try and prevent this weight loss, and hopefully improve quality of life and slow down disease progression for our patients. So this is my husband, Derek. He's doing research, particularly into this. He was trained as a neuroendocrinologist, so he's interested in how the blood talks to the brain and how it controls initially obesity, but he's seen the light and moved to MND research. So he's trying to figure out how weight actually impacts people with disease. And I know Rebecca's focusing on the people who are putting on weight. Derek's focusing on the people who are losing weight, and has developed a research program called Eat for MND, because your patients, your doctors are always telling you to eat. So he's looking at endocrine and appetite targets and therapies for motor neuron disease. So this is what we've called it. And we're hoping to get a lot of celebrity chefs involved in getting a cookbook together for people with MND so that people can eat for MND and we can raise more awareness about the importance of maintaining weight for this disease. I'm just going to, because I can't peek at you guys over this thing. So what contributes to weight loss in MND? Well, appetite is a very complex thing. I'm not sure how many people here in the audience with MND have lost their appetite. Can I see a show of hands? Or they're not wanting to eat, or they're not enjoying food as much as they used to, or they get fuller faster, or when they see something they're hungry and then they eat it and they're like, oh, maybe not. So we're looking at a lot of aspects that impact appetite. Hypogesia, this is, MND patients actually experience a loss of taste buds, so they have a change in taste. Some people can't have coffee anymore, or they don't like certain foods anymore. They start switching towards different preferences. Some of this could be because of some cognitive involvement, and Rebecca would have touched on this. People with dementia tend to lose control over what they eat, and they tend to eat quite a lot, and so they put on weight. But there are some people with MND who just don't like eating what they used to eat anymore. Bulbar symptoms, you would expect that someone who's got weakness in the swallowing muscles might eat less, and that might impact their appetite because they've got fear of choking, so they've got anxiety and perhaps some depression that's associated with it. Gastric discomfort and delayed emptying. There's evidence to show that there might be a change in the bugs in the gut in people with MND. That's certainly the case for Parkinson's. They think that your gut-brain axis might actually impact disease progression. And we're looking at this, but decreased gut motility might not be something that's happening because of the disease. It might just be because people are sitting more, and so they don't have as much motility in their gut. Upper extremity weakness, if you can't feed yourself as efficiently, are you going to lose appetite? Longer eating times and social isolation. Eating is a very social thing, and so does that actually impact whether or not you will eat more or less? And fatigue. A lot of patients experience fatigue when they're eating, and does that actually turn you off food? So these are all the things that we're looking at, but in particular, Derek is interested in two very specific things. The hormones in your blood that tell your brain that you're hungry or that you're full. So we know in our MND patients that there's a hormone called ghrelin, which is released from your stomach, and it tells your brain that you're full. We've found previously that people with MND have very high amounts of this ghrelin compared to people who don't have MND. So they might actually have signals coming back from their body telling them that they're full, when maybe they're not. And then, of course, things going on in the brain that might actually be impacting disease. When you eat something, I don't know whether you do it, but I certainly do, you start to think of things that bring back great memories. You know, you associate food with a certain time in your life, or something that your mum used to cook. And all of these things that are associated with pleasure, reward, behaviours around these things might actually be impacted in MND, because we know that MND is no longer considered a disease that just affects your motor function, that it might be affecting other areas of the brain. And so it makes sense that these reward pathways might actually be impacted in MND. And so this is what Derek is focusing on, and we've got funding from the Wesley as well as MND Australia to look at this research. And so a lot of ongoing studies that we have around this energy use equation is not just continuing to measure metabolism or energy use in our patients, but the appetite story. We're looking at activity. Are people more active, and is that causing them to use more energy? And if they're not more active, why are they using more energy? And so we've got activity trackers out in the field. We have 16 of them on people at any given time, whether that's someone with MND or someone without MND. And we measure their activity on 3 axes, just to see whether or not we can match their energy use to what they're doing in their day-to-day lives. We're also looking at the gut. We've actually taken fecal samples from 50 MND patients and 50 non-affected people. We've analysed all of the bugs that are in that sample, looking to see whether or not there's something different. We were about to write up the manuscript, but the data analysis that they used to analyse this data happened to change in the process. So we've been analysing the data for a year and a half, and now it's changed, so we have to go back and reanalyse all the data to make sure that it's up to the standards of the area of research. Okay, so other ongoing studies, something that's really piqued our interest with energy use is this concept of fatigue. And what we've noticed is that with these activity trackers, people will tell us that they're active or low active, but the activity trackers might actually be telling us something different, because someone's activity is relative to what they believe their activity to be like prior to them getting the disease. Someone who is very fit and healthy, who is running around all the time, might now consider themselves to be sedentary, versus someone else who was like that and considers themselves to be low active. So one thing that came up time and time again was that people with MND were telling us that they were getting fatigue. And this is data that we've collected in the clinic with our patients. MND patients here represented by the aqua dots. And this is the cutoff here for clinical fatigue. And you can see that a lot of the patients lie above this cutoff. So they're almost experiencing this chronic fatigue syndrome type of fatigue. And what we notice is that people with fatigue, and this is the fatigue score here, so the higher your fatigue is, the lower your ALS-FRS-R score. So the more fatigued you are, the lower your function is. So if you've got lower function, why are you fatiguing faster? And what we found from our activity trackers is that this is data from 2 brothers who are living in the same house. This is the control, and this is the brother with motor neuron disease. And what you can see is that the brother with motor neuron disease spends less time standing, more time sitting, and more time lying down compared to his healthy brother, or non-affected brother, should I say. And so we're using these activity trackers to try and figure out what's going on in the real world and how this might be helping us answer questions about fatigue and energy use overall. Ongoing studies are also looking at cells and developing cell models of the disease so that we can understand what's happening. Ian before mentioned something about skin biopsies. In Brisbane, we do take skin and muscle biopsies from people with MND as well as people without MND. From the skin cells, we turn them into neurons that look like the ones in your spinal cord and brain. We study how they use energy, how that links to your body's energy use, and we can screen drugs on these cells to see if we can have them live longer in the dish. And these are the muscle biopsies that we're taking from our patients and controls. So we take muscle stem cells from the muscle biopsy, and you can actually grow up these stem cells into muscle fibers in a dish. And you can study how the muscle is using energy and compare that to the body. What we've found is that muscle from MND patients tends to use fuel substrates very differently. Muscle tends to rely on sugar as an energy substrate. That's how it generates all of its energy. What we found in our mouse models of the disease was that they tend to use fat instead of sugar. And we've recently completed data analysis to show that this also happens in the muscles that we're getting from our patients. And this is important because even though fat is a very rich energy source, it actually takes a lot more energy to break it down to generate energy. So it could be that your muscle's actually working overtime to actually maintain your function. So collaboration is key. All of the research that we do in Brisbane looking at energy use and biopsies and activity tracking, as well as the gut biome, is also done by 2 sites overseas, in the UK and in the Netherlands. So we're actually running this study at 3 sites, and the idea is that we're going to generate more information over a larger number of people to really try and figure out how energy use impacts disease. So these are all the people who have involved in the research in the lab. Now, the next part of my talk, I want to talk about clinical trials because I think there's some interest in that. So clinical trials, we're really trying to trial a treatment for MND. And this is to improve survival, slow down disease progression, improve quality of life, and improve function. And again, much like research, clinical trials have to be high quality and very comprehensive, and they actually add knowledge to the disease that we don't currently know about, or they're adding knowledge by answering questions that we think are, I guess, pertinent to the disease. You know, they're asking questions about whether or not certain things that are going on in cells are actually what's causing the disease. Clinical trials are completely voluntary. There's no need to get involved if you don't want to. There are different phases of clinical trials. You would have heard there's phase 1, 2, 3, and 4, and all of those phases mean different things. Again, being involved in a clinical trial would mean that you may get more attention and oversight and care because you're seeing the clinical nurses as part of the trial, but as well as the neurologists. And again, being involved in a clinical trial could mean that you want to be proactive and contributing to the greater good. So where are we with treatments for MND? Someone before mentioned riluzole. It is the only drug that's available for MND in Australia. It was shown to have some survival benefit, and it's the only drug in MND that's been tested in humans first and shown to work before it was then tested in mice. Every other drug for MND that's been shown to have a benefit in a mouse has not translated into anything positive in clinical trials with humans. The other drug that was recently approved by the FDA is edaravone. It's not available in Australia. This is an infusion. It's 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. So you take the drug for 2 weeks via infusion, you have 2 weeks off, and then you're back on the drug for 2 weeks. It's very expensive, I think anywhere in the realm of $100,000, $150,000. And so there's only one person I know of in Australia who's taken that. And there's actually an oral formulation being developed in the hope that people might be able to take an oral form rather than having to go for an infusion every 2 weeks. But the thing about this edaravone is it's quite controversial. If you look at these 2 lines here, the red is the people who are on the active drug, and the blue are the people who are on the placebo. And you can see that the difference between the 2 lines is not great. And so the only benefit of edaravone that was shown was that it actually improved function for people who are very early on in the disease. So whether edaravone works for people who are later on in the disease, We don't know, and the group is actually going back to look at this data to see whether or not there's any information that can be extracted from that clinical trial data. So considerations for getting involved in clinical trials. You have to think about the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And Ian touched on this before. There are different criteria depending on what the trial is looking at. If the trial, for example, is looking at a drug that improves muscle function, and particularly breathing function, it's likely that one of the inclusion criteria is going to be focused on your breathing capacity or your FEC score, because that's what they're trying to measure the drug having an impact on. A lot of criteria are also involved around how long you've had the disease for, whether that was the onset of symptoms or when you were diagnosed, as well as your function overall. And the reason why these trials have these criteria is because they want to show the largest or best benefit for this drug. And so it's very strict. It's not necessarily the neurologist who's making up these criteria, but the drug companies are also involved because they want to show that their drug has benefit. So it can be very frustrating when you're trying to get into a trial and they say, no, you don't meet these criteria, but understand it's not always the neurologist's fault, and they're doing the best that they can. The phase of the trial. So some trials are early in the phase 1, where they're just testing the compound to see whether it's safe or what dose should be used. And then there's phase 3 trials, which are more involved, more people involved. The duration is something you need to think about. The time commitment associated with a clinical trial. Some trials run for months, 2 months, 3 months, some run for a whole year. And you've got to decide whether that time commitment of 1 year suits you, or whether you want to go for a shorter trial that's 3 months, then have that break in between and then go for the next trial. It really comes down to a personal choice of time commitments. The placebo. Most trials will have a placebo. They need to know what the active drug is doing compared to something that is not the active drug. If you don't have a placebo, it's hard to know whether or not what you're seeing is because of the drug that you're actually taking. And post-trial access. A lot of trials that are in the early stages are just testing the drug for a certain amount of time, and generally it's unlikely that you will be able to access that drug once the trial has finished. So this is something that you also need to think about when you're going into clinical trials, and definitely something to ask about if you want to know, can you actually access this afterwards? Okay, so there are different phases of clinical trials. A lot of people start here in the preclinical stage. This goes for several years, 10, 20, 30, 40 years of research in the lab to try and find what's happening, try and find out what's happening with MND before we can develop a drug target. There's phase 1 trials. Usually these are small numbers of people. You're looking at the safety or side effects of a drug and what dose you should use. Phase 2 is an increased number of people in the trial, looking at the benefit, still looking at the safety and side effects of the drug and how we can use it, whether that's oral, whether that's IV, intramuscular, what approach do we use with the drug. Phase 3, these are the more advanced trials. Thousands of people can be involved in this trial. We're looking at efficacy of the drug. Is the drug doing what we want it to do? Long-term effects of the drug. Sometimes these trials can go for years. So what is happening to people who are on this drug for a longer period of time? And usually it's multi-site. These phase 3 trials are run over different clinics all around the world, so we can gather a lot of data about this drug. And then phase 4. Phase 4 is when the drug has been approved for use, and you just continue to monitor the people who are on this drug. And there's considerations for use in other conditions or in combination with other compounds. And all throughout these trials, you're likely to see a placebo come in. And so when you go into a trial, you need to know that it could be that you get the active drug or you get the placebo. And usually the double blind, you won't know, the neurologist won't know, and the clinical nurse won't know. And it's better to have it blinded that way so there's no bias in the way that the results are analysed. So some clinical trials. There's been over 40 clinical trials listed on the ALS TDI website since the beginning of this year. So it's very research trial active at this point in time for MND. 5 years ago, you wouldn't have seen this. There's been a lot of awareness in the disease, a lot more funding going into this disease, and now we're able to run these trials. Recently, there was the copper ATSM trial. Okay, the copper ATSM was shown to improve survival in mouse models of MND. The phase 1 trial has finished in Australia, and we're still waiting for those results to be published. Triumec was the drug that was based on the theory of retroviruses triggering the disease. The results from that phase 1 trial are pending, but there's funding applications for phase 2 trials. IC14 is an antibody that dampens the innate immune system. I don't know if anyone's touched on it, but in MND you get some excessive inflammation, which might heat the brain up more than what it should. And so if you can dampen that inflammation, you can cool the brain down a bit, in a sense. And so the IC14 trial, which was completed in Brisbane earlier this year, was looking at that, and the results are pending. But I know that the company is applying for phase 2 funding to take it further, not only in Australia, but also in the US. So current active trials going on in Australia, there's the Fortitude ALS trial, looking at a drug that helps muscle function and contractility. It follows on from a tirasemtiv trial, which didn't look too good, but the company is convinced that this new drug is much better than tirasemtiv. They're currently recruiting across 4 states, and it's a shorter trial. It's 3 months in duration. The Tecfidera trial, TILS trial, someone touched on this before. This is actually an MS drug that's been used for multiple sclerosis. It dampens the inflammation that occurs in the brain. Currently recruiting in 5 states, and this is a 48-week trial. So it is a long amount of time, can be intensive. In Brisbane, I think we've had someone pull out because of that time commitment. Levosimendan, the REFALS trial, looking at whether or not this drug that's being used for chronic heart failure might actually be helpful in MND, currently recruiting across 5 sites, also 48 weeks in duration. And then there's this other study, DEALS, which is funded in part by MND Research Institute of Australia. It's a phase 2 trial looking at whether or not particular swallowing exercises with or without formulations of olive oil might actually help people in their swallowing function and therefore improve quality of life and survival. And that's a 4-month trial. So there are a lot of untested compounds that is in the disease. A lot of people will self-administer perhaps compounds that they've read about online. RCH4 being a perfect example of a drug that, you know, there's testimonials online about how it's been very great for people with MND, and then other people are trying to source this drug. These drugs aren't proven. There are no clinical trials to show that they've actually had any benefit for people. If you are interested in looking up information about these compounds, there's a website called ALS Untangled. It's actually run by a neurologist at Duke University, where they review a lot of these alternative off-label treatments. And so you can actually read about all the information that's out there about these compounds and what has been shown and what their recommendations are. Then there's a website called Patients Like Me. I don't know if you've been there as yet, but it's a website that's contributed to by anyone and everyone who's taken a compound, and they actually report on that website whether or not the drug was beneficial for them, what it did, how it impacted them, any side effects. And so you can read about compounds on that website as well. Someone asked about stem cells before. There are stem cell therapies currently undergoing for motor neuron disease. The most famous, I think, is this Neurone Brainstorm Cell Therapeutics phase 3 trial, which is being run by Brainstorm. It's a very interesting company. We don't know what's actually in the formulation of stem cells, so that's one unknown. But this phase 3 trial has come off the back of a phase 2 to show that injection of the stem cells into the spinal cord or muscle was safe and tolerable for people with MND. So they're running this trial over 6 locations in the US. Currently is not available in Australia. For a while there were people rallying to get this treatment in Australia, but that hasn't really amounted to much, unfortunately. And the thing is, these aren't stem cells in the typical sense of it's a stem cell that's been turned into a neuron and then put back into your body And the idea is that it will then reform connections, and so you'd get the neurons forming back with your muscle, and then that would eventually improve function. That's not so much the case. In fact, a lot of the stem cell trials at the moment are the injection of specific cells that actually release a lot of positive factors that help maintain neurons and help maintain their growth. So it might dampen some inflammation, or it might improve the neuron at that point in time, but there's nothing at this point where we can inject a neuron into somebody and have it regrow. If you think about it, injecting a neuron into someone's spinal cord and then hoping that it will reconnect to the toe is quite a scientific feat, because all of your connections in your body form as an embryo. And as an embryo, you've got very special signals in your body that tell the nerve cells where to go. A lot of those signals are lost in adulthood, and so it's being able to recapitulate that before we can actually build new circuits in the human body. Possible future trials. Australia is really punching above its weight when it comes to trials and the amount of money that we have going into research. There are a lot of dedicated researchers. There are 2 compounds that are actually undergoing extensive preclinical testing in Brisbane at the moment. The first is PMX205. Again, that blocks inflammation. It's shown positive effects in multiple mouse models of motor neuron disease. And they're currently doing target engagement studies. So as part of the clinic, people can donate a blood sample, and they're seeing whether or not this compound will actually bind to the right cells in those blood samples to show that the drug is not having off-target effects. So once those studies are completed, they're hoping to hit clinical trials by 2020. FA4 is a drug that's being developed by the Queensland Brain Institute. They're trying to develop an FA4 inhibitor because it's been shown that FA4 could actually stop the recovery of motor neurons after injury. So if you block that, can you actually improve motor neuron recovery? They're undergoing a lot of preclinical testing at the moment. Some preliminary data shows that it seems to have some benefit in improving function in mouse models of MND. So they're hoping to use that drug in more mouse models, because that's actually quite essential for MND research, to show that it has beneficial effects in more than one model, and it's not just a random off chance that it worked for that mouse. And they're hoping to get into trials by next year. And actually a lot of these preclinical studies have been funded by MND Research Institute of Australia, as well as the Queensland government. Thankfully, the Queensland government put a lot of money into innovation, so they've been able to secure funding from there, as well as fight MND. And then of course there's a lot of drug repurposing initiatives going on in Brisbane. I'm quite heavily involved in that. The drug development process can take quite a long time, so we want to use drugs that are already being used for other conditions. We know that they're safe in humans, and so we can actually expedite clinical trials in that way, because we don't necessarily have to go through the arduous process of safety and tolerability. And so these trials, or these studies, are actually not only just being funded by MND Australia, but I'm working with a lot of people overseas, and so we've got French money as well as Italian money coming into this research so that we can repurpose drugs. And I'm not sure if you would have recently read about this or heard about this breakthrough for Parkinson's disease. It would have been in the news the last couple of days. There's a drug that they've been trialling in Parkinson's mouse models, and they showed that they could actually improve function in these mice and slow down the death of the neurons, and they're hoping to repurpose this for MND as well. And so towards precision medicine, I think precision medicine at the moment, they're these big words that people throw around. It really is a dream for any disease to be able to be successful with precision medicine, but it's more than just words. Precision medicine, in my opinion, needs to focus on every individual patient, because people are different, we know that. So we have to know about each individual patient. We need to know how they present clinically. Rebecca would have touched on it earlier this morning. People are different. Some people get weakness in their foot, some people get weakness in their hand. What separates them from each other? And we need to know that before we can actually start developing good clinical trials. Are we going to treat everyone the same? I think the answer is no. There's a push now internationally to start being a bit more clever in our clinical trial design and not necessarily having a blanket approach. One is called this N of 1 trial, where you follow the person and see how they respond over time as an N of 1, just that person. And then you have multiple people compared to themselves. Genetics. We can't at the moment separate people on the genetics, but the genetics will play a role of whether or not we have a group of people who have certain genetics and a certain presentation in the clinic versus another group of people. How people respond at the whole body level. Energy use being one example of how people respond differently. And so we're actually in Brisbane testing a compound that we have shown reverses that increase in energy use in our mice. And we're now testing it in our stem cell derived neurons and as well as the muscle that we're getting from our patients. Cellular features, how the cell dies. Why is the cell susceptible? Is one group of cells more susceptible to dying in one patient versus another? This is another benefit of stem cell research, actually. So there are two ways of making neurons. One is to take a skin sample from somebody, grow up the skin to millions of numbers of cells, and you can turn them into stem cells and then turn them into neurons. What happens is when you turn a skin cell into a stem cell, not only do you tell it to become something else, but you also essentially wipe a lot of its environmental memory. So you know what would have happened to the cell, so you know, okay, this might be causing this neuron to be susceptible from this individual. That's if you make a stem cell neuron. In my lab, we've developed, or trying to develop a way where we can turn the skin cell directly into a neuron. So an adult skin cell directly into an adult neuron, meaning then that neuron maintains all of the environmental triggers that would have come across in its lifetime. We can actually compare the two cell types and see whether or not there are these tags on the DNA from the environment which might be causing these cells to be susceptible. And we can make these two cell types from the same person because we have the skin cell from that individual. Transdisciplinary. This means that it can't just be neuroscientists working on MND. We have dietitians, we have speech pathologists, physios, we have bioengineers, we have statisticians, we have people coming from all around the traps to be involved in MND research because they want to contribute to something that's bigger. And then of course collaboration, and that really involves the transdisciplinary approach. I think in the last few years I can confidently say that Australia has become phenomenal at collaborating specifically for MND research. There's been people, I think, isolated in their silos for quite a number of years, and with the push from MND Australia, push from FightMND, and most importantly, push from the people who are impacted by the disease, so people living with the disease, carers and families and friends, they're the ones saying, no, there's no point everybody working separately anymore. People have to work together. You can't double up on things, because if you double up on things, you're wasting resources. And so collaboration at this point in time in Australia is absolutely amazing.